Welcome to Thinking Aloud and to this video for our BYU Humanities website. I want to thank, as always, Marcus Smith for letting us use his space. This is really lovely here. And we're visiting them with two scholars instead of one, like our usual. We have Kimberly Johnson here and Oren Izenberg. Kimberly Johnson is known to many who listen to this program. She's professor of English at BYU, where she's a poet, translator, and scholar of English Renaissance literature, especially of lyric poetry. She's received several fellowships for her work, which include awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Mellon Foundation. And this week, she's organized a symposium at BYU on the devotional lyric entitled Illuminating the Word. And one of the guests she's invited is Oren Izenberg, who's Associate Professor of English at the University of California at Irvine. Izenberg's the author of the book Being Numerous, subtitled Poetry and the Ground of Social Life, published in 2011, and is a recipient of fellowships from the Franke Institute for the Humanities at the University of Chicago and also the National Endowment for the Humanities. It makes sense, Kim, to start with you by asking you what the inspiration was for this symposium on the devotional lyric.
Well, it's funny. I had been at a conference on John Donne last winter, and I got to talking with one of the other participants in that conference, a religious studies and theology person named Constance Fury. And we were talking about the relationships between lyric poetry, the history of lyric poetry, and the history of religious ritual. And we had this sort of invigorating conversation, sort of revolving around this anthology that I'd recently published or co-edited. And Constance said, "Wouldn't it be great to be able to have this conversation?" And I said, "Hold that thought. I can make this happen." So it was sort of born out of this tiny little conversation that Constance Fury and I had. And it makes sense to me because over the course of the history of lyric poetry, there's been a close association between the writing of these sort of short poems and the participation in religious ritual. Though there have been negotiations and renegotiations over the course of the last 3 millennia, as you might expect. Yeah. Nevertheless, there are maybe natural affinities between the two practices. And we wanted to just create a conversation, an ongoing couple of days worth of conversation that would bring in perspectives from people who work on devotional poetry as a scholarly pursuit, people who theorize lyric as a scholarly pursuit, people who approach it from a theological or religious studies background, and people who are currently writing poetry. I thought that would be a lively exchange.
It's a very eclectic group. Yeah, it's a nicely designed symposium, I think, in that respect. In fact, Constance Fury mentioned to me yesterday how engaging she finds the group, the mixture of people. You mentioned the 3 millennia of devotional lyric poetry. It's pretty impressive. And in fact, the anthology that you co-edited with Jay Hopler, Before the Door of God, breaks this down into several historical periods. One of them, you talk about the flourishing of the devotional lyric, which is the late 16th, early 17th century. Sure. Why do you think that era was an era in which the devotional lyric flourished? And what are some examples of people who wrote during that era that you like especially?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the reasons, there are a complex of reasons that you see this flourishing. One is simply the increase of literacy, that more people are writing poetry. But lyric starts to gain traction in a sort of unprecedented way during the course of the Renaissance. And it probably does have to do with a combination of new ideas of what constitutes selfhood, as occasioned by the inquiries of this new humanism that was coming into being, new inquiries about the value of persons, as were precipitated by the Reformation and by its sort of transfer of focus in matters of faith from the sort of organized cosmology to a more individually centered cosmology, which brought with it all sorts of new, more urgent pressures on the conceptualization of selfhood, what it means to be a person, what it means to be a soul, and how that soul relates to God. These are all issues that get amplified and stirred up and fueled. Those are 3 different metaphors that I've just used there. But all of them get sort of excited by the Reformation and by this sort of rise of humanism. So there are a lot of ingredients that go into the stew and make it a sort of ripe pot
Sure.
to make lyrics come out of.
Do you have any favorite devotional poets from that era?
I have all the favorite devotional
I know that there are many that are in the anthology, for example, but a
But
couple
certainly, I mean, John Donne is exemplary in many ways because he wears on his sleeve the sort of fraughtness of the process of all these negotiations and reinterpretations and anxieties. John Donne is sort of the poster boy for religious anxiety, and rightly so. And so I like to spend time with Donne. I like the fact that Donne disorganizes the way that we expect faith to go. George Herbert always seems to be more staid, more predictable, but in fact is just as freaked out as John Donne is. And there's something pleasurable in seeing somebody who is on his face pious and I can't come up with a better word than unanxious in his participation in faith, nevertheless registering the tremors of uncertainty that undergird all negotiations with the unknown.
Yeah, great. Now, our other guest here, Oren Izenberg, has not written extensively about Donne or Herbert, but he was a guest that you invited.
Yes.
What was the impetus for inviting Oren Izenberg? Yeah.
Oren Izenberg has written this wonderful book called Being Numerous, in which he encourages us to think about lyric poetry differently than many critics have tended to think of lyric poetry. And I'm going to leave the sort of good back of the jacket summary to him, but his sense is that there is a moral and ethical component to lyric poetry that has to do with the constitution of persons and how we understand the value of personhood and how that is a deeply moral act. And so even though he's not somebody who has plighted his troth, so to speak, to the devotional lyric tradition, the arguments that he has to make about lyric certainly do reflect the kinds of ethical overlaps that exist between poetic practice and religious practice.
All right, good. So let me ask you, about this book, Oren. I agree with Kim. It's a really interesting, smart book. It's a really interesting read of the poets that you address in the book. And some of these poets, people like William Butler Yeats, George Uppen, Frank O'Hara, did any of these lyric poets write specifically lyric poems?
Mm-hmm.
Devotional lyric poems.
Oh, devotional lyric
Sorry,
poems.
devotional lyric poems, sorry. Because we can ask about the lyric more broadly, but I'm curious about the devotional lyric for a moment.
Well, Yeats has an enormously complex relation to religious poetry.
Yeah.
He inherits not the devotional tradition in the sense of its dailiness, the negotiation of a kind of ongoing life in relation to spiritual pursuits or the spiritual sense of self. He inherits a kind of apocalyptic tradition from Blake and that form of religious romanticism. So he was a deeply religious poet, but his religion was immensely idiosyncratic. He was interested in theosophy and in astrology and in just about any kind of tradition that was non-mainstream. Precisely on the ground of its non-mainstreamness. That is to say, the more orthodox a tradition was, the more suspect it was. And so we had this interesting combination of a religious temperament and an experimental skeptical temperament. So he would join these organizations like the Order of the Golden Dawn, which were filled with esoteric rituals and the kind of Neoplatonist versions of religion. And then he would get kicked out of them because he would want to test the rituals scientifically. So he would go through these initiation procedures and then he would be evicted from But his poetry is illegible without a sense of struggle with transcendence. So he, more than the others about whom I've written, was a poet who is not just kind of negotiating with a world, as poets after 1945 are often said to have done, drained of transcendence, or in which the loss of the transcendent is a kind of crisis, but one for whom the possibility of a re-achieved relation to transcendence was always driving his poetic work.
Yeah, okay. Do you see the devotional lyric as a subset of the lyric, or is it a different kind of poem because it's devotional?
Well, what I said a moment ago about these kind of two traditions of religious lyric, the devotional and the apocalyptic, is maybe a way into this question. Because there's a way in which all poetry is devotional in the sense that it represents kind of ongoing negotiation with the work of being alive in the world.
Totally. Amen.
And an intense consciousness of the rules by means of which any way of making sense is conducted or constructed, right? So because poets have to make their own little worlds, have to make the worlds of their own writing, they find themselves in the position of people who are obligated to the making and maintenance of sense. Mm-hmm. They find themselves in a kind of miniature version of the position of God. And they also wonder what has licensed them to act as gods in this way.
Right.
So there's a kind of ritual performance every time you revisit the scene of the blank page. There's a ritual performance anytime you take up the words of another person, another poet, take them into your own mouth and ask yourself, are these my words? In what sense, as I repeat this language, whether it's actual liturgical devotional language or poetic language, in what sense is this language mine? What does it mean for me to say it now, today? So in that sense, there is a way in which all poetry belongs to the devotional tradition. All lyric poetry belongs to the devotional tradition. There's, again, that additional tradition of prophetic or apocalyptic poetry that is a slightly separate conversation.
But. Yeah, sure. That's an interesting answer, though, about the devotional nature of all poetry. I mean, that's I find that really insightful. Perhaps on that basis, I can initiate a discussion between the two of you. You've each written books that make strong claims about poetry, but they're rather different claims. So, Kim, you published a book this year entitled Made Flesh, Sacrament and Poetics in Post-Reformation England. And in it, you bring special attention to the way poems work as literary artifacts, right? So the specificity of poems' structure, their language, etc. But you, Oren, in your book, draw a distinction between poems as artifacts and poems as ideas or intentions. And in fact, you draw a distinction between poetry and poems. Yeah. Let me ask you first if you would sort of expound a bit on what that distinction is about.
Sure. The distinction is a distinction of long-standing. Shelley, for example, in his defense of poetry, makes the distinction between poetry in what he calls the general sense. And poetry in the general sense includes all forms of cultural construction. So on his account, the makers of laws and the makers of cities and countries, the makers of new intellectual systems and sciences are all poets because they all partake of a generative impulse, a capacity for making that belongs to the human being as such. In contrast to that, there are poems in the particular sense, which are the verbal objects that we call poems. And he's interested in the relation between the two of them, but also in the non-identity between the two of them. So as I sort of dwelled and took up this distinction, it seems to me that there are poets who are interested in poems and in the making of poems and the making of these artifacts that create charged relations between individuals and language on the page. And poets who are interested in poetry, that is the generative capacity that gives rise to the capacity to make or to belong to the world.
Okay. Kim, you're a scholar and a poet also. Does that distinction hold true for you? And does it hold true for the devotional lyric in particular?
I'm going to flip that question just a moment because while he's been talking, it's occurred to me, I've been joking over the course of the last couple of days that Oren and I disagree about a number of things. But I actually think that we're coming at the same problem from two sides of a coin. He is far more interested in poetry in the general sense. And I, as both a scholar and as a practitioner, sort of don't care about poetry in the general sense.
But you do.
But I really, really am interested in the poem as an object, the poem as an artifact, and in trying to discover the ways in which that object works, not only upon the reader, but also independently of the reader, if you can sort of conceive of of a poem's independence from the reader. So I'm interested in this sort of material artifact that is the remnant or the leftover of the poetic process, this sort of bringing poems into being, the making that Oren describes and accounts for so beautifully in this book.
Okay, so I'm wondering, on that basis, if you could flip around the idea of what's general and what's particular. I mean, poetry is a general category, poems are specific. But, in your book, Made Flesh, Kim, you talk about this poem by George Herbert, the poem Love Unknown, which on its surface communicates kind of a theme of grace over works. But you point out that the actual poem is so invested in labor, in the labored nature of the lines. They emphasize labor, that it seems actually to suggest a Catholic theology of works over that of grace. In that respect, do you think that poems are more complex and more general than the idea of poetry?
I think that poems invite us to treat them as if they are more complex and more general than the large idea. I think that that's the quality, again, to gesture back toward Oren's argument, the quality that he describes where a poem communicates more than its words do. I mean, that's certainly true. There's something that happens that's beyond the mere mechanics of sentence and grammar and structure and things like that. So what is that thing? That thing that we experience when we participate in poetry as readers, as writers, as thinkers and scholars? What is that thing? That's something that seems to defy particularization, and yet I'm really interested in popping the hood to see if I can talk about how it happens.
Good. Oren, how would you respond to Kim's assessment of that?
Well, I'll
question?
go with more complex, because poetry in the general sense, that is to say, the idea of poetry or the capacity to make poems, aims at, or the poets who are interested in it, aim at a kind of burning simplicity. They want a purification of all of the complexities that give rise to division within the world. Right? So the work of making a particular thing or of receiving a particular thing is charged with distinction making. It's charged with working out of the boundaries of sense. And the poets who are invested in poetry in the general sense are invested in the idea that there could be something like a meaning or a value or a sense without boundaries, that would exclude no one, that would not draw a picture of what it is to be a person, that could conceivably leave anyone out who is in need of moral regard. So in that sense, generality or indeed universality is what poetry aims at, whereas poems aim always at particularity, they aim at solidarity, they aim at exchange, they aim at conversation, but they cannot achieve, even if they desire, universality or generality in the largest imaginable way.
Okay.
I'm with him.
All right, good. I'm perfect agreement. I'm so glad. We're done. Yeah, no, a few more minutes, actually. This idea about universality, which is an idea to which you appeal in your book, and it's a really compelling category. One question I would have is just, is universality always the same? I mean, is it the same over time? I'm thinking here about the question of literary history when you have poems that strive towards something like an absolute. And specifically, how do you tell the story in literary history about the devotional lyric? One could just create a chronology. This got written then and this got written then. But does the devotional lyric form demand a different kind of literary historical telling? Kim, what do you think? And then I'll give both of you have a chance to answer this question.
I think the devotional lyric form at least requires an awareness of the varying contexts that produce the poems, because the poems respond necessarily to the pressures of culture and religion and the sort of the way that culture and religion make politics happen in different ways. And the poems are sensitive antennas to those kinds of vibrations. And so a devotional lyric that's written in 1550 is going to resonate to a different frequency than a devotional lyric written in 1944. So I think that this is perhaps not true necessarily of all lyrics, though I'm not sure that I'm necessarily going to commit to that position. But because the devotional lyrics sort of intends a negotiation of the kinds of theological questions that are in the air, it invites a historical awareness. Maybe I'll put it that way. It doesn't demand, but invites it invites a richer yield from a historical awareness.
Okay, is it a different kind of historical? Yeah, I think it's an interesting way to put it. Is it a different kind of historical awareness than you would trace if you were doing a history of the novel, or a history of the elegy, or the descriptive poem?
Yeah, probably. See, that's why I was qualifying it. I'm not sure that that's true. I don't think that. At the same time, I want to say literature is transhistorical or ahistorical, and it is, it is there to be, I don't know, sucked in deeply across boundaries of time and space. Yet, nevertheless, if you know something about early 20th century southern United States, you'll get more out of Faulkner than you would if you didn't, right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. That's
Oren,
a cop-out.
No, it's not. Oren, how would you take that question?
Our accounts of the precincts of the sacred do vary across time. How far they extend, what their boundaries are, what actually lies inside of them, and so on. And so, yes, obviously, any account of universality is going to be a historical account. In the vector of travel for those accounts in the, say, move from the 19th into the 20th century has always been toward a greater abstraction and a greater minimalism. So, for example, if the question was originally, right, how do we create an account of the person so abstract, so minimal, so non-demanding that we don't leave Jews out? Right, in the 1940s. Now we're worried about an account of the person so minimal, so subtractive of particularity that we want to make sure not to leave animals out, that we want to make sure not to leave rocks and trees out, right? So that there's a kind of expanding ecological consciousness that wants to treat elements of the world with the privilege of personhood. That is to say, with the moral regard that we bring to those things that deserve moral regard. Right, so there is a kind of historical vector toward minimalism with respect to our account of persons and our account of universality. That doesn't get to the generic question that you were asking a moment ago about how it is that a history of devotional lyric could be different than the history of, say, elegy. But I think the problem is shaped the same way. Because, right, if you're interested in the history of elegy, you're interested, on the one hand, in what it means to have undergone a loss.
And history itself is a kind of a loss in that respect.
Sure.
Right.
History is a long litany of losses.
Yes. Yeah, the very idea
Thanks
of history.
Thanks for the word litany there. I appreciate it.
Okay, good. We have a few minutes left. Some scholars argue that poetry exists not only to be appreciated, but to achieve real effects in the world, right? That poetry should move us, it should persuade us, it should mobilize public sentiment. Now, Kim, you're a poet, and you also write devotional poetry. Do you see your devotional poems in that way? Are they written to move? Are they written to be appreciated? And are they different as devotional poems than if they were poems of a different type?
Well, I don't write all devotional poems. I've got a few devotional poems. But I think that, it will not surprise you at all to hear that I sort of stop being aware of what might happen to them once they leave me. I'm interested in them as a poet, as a scholar, as artifacts. I'm really interested in how to make something that functions with gears. And what's the phrase that Williams uses? A machine made of words. I try not to be mechanistic, but I do feel to some degree that there are components that can be manipulated, and that you get down and greasy and dirty with them, and you figure out how the whole thing operates. And so that is all just to say that it's overwhelming to me to even imagine what might happen to them after they leave me. That's beyond my purview. That's beyond what I can imagine or control or conceive. And so I just sort of content myself with the thing at hand, the object at hand, which I try to honor and reverence as a thing worth attending to, regardless of what happens to it after it leaves my sole possession.
Okay. Does that resonate, Oren, with the work of the poets you address in your book? You know, the Frank O'Hara's, the George Oppens. Does that resonate, or do they have a different view of their poetry than what Kim just articulated?
These poets are marked by, and maybe this is true of many poets. I don't know if it's true of Kim. She can attest to that for herself. These poets are marked by a kind of interesting and profound disrelation between the work of making, which is completely absorbing, to which they devoted formidable and powerful energies, and their desires for poetry. Mm-hmm. That is to say, what they imagined or wished would happen in some way as a result of having made this thing. How it is, what the path is from the work of the making and the destiny of the made thing was not something that they could imagine or could theorize fully. And there's just a huge mystery in there, right? How it is that poems come to make change in the world. They do, they have, they will again. But how it is that happens, those are acts of chance, they're acts of grace, they're kinds of miracles. Yeah. When a poem gets taken up and makes something happen, it cannot be as a result of the intention or the casting forth from the hand of the maker. It's a kind of grace.
All right, and can I say that what he's just described, I mean, it would feel presumptuous on my part. It would feel like a little bit of hubris to imagine that there's something that I could make that's going to go out and change the world. But the one way in which I can sort of understand and maybe apply the kinds of ideas or the sort of ideals that Oren's articulating here is when I'm in the classroom with my students, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I can't guarantee that any world change is going to happen because of words I put on the page, but I can virtually guarantee, and it doesn't feel hubristic to do so, that there's going to be world change that happens when I teach a classroom full of students how to engage ethically and aesthetically and responsibly with not just one text, but all the texts.
Okay, so world change on a classroom level, the macrocosm, the microcosm. Right. We're back to John Donne.
That's right.
And on that note, thank you both for talking this morning. It's been a great symposium you put together, Kim.
Thank you.
Oren, thank you for coming to BYU.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt.